Welcome back, everyone, to the Gentleman's Wrestling Podcast. I am Jesse Collins. Joining me today is Phil Strum. Phil is the host of Under the Ring Pro Wrestling Conversations podcast. It's part of the USA Today network, which, curiously enough, and the reason I wanted to talk to Phil today was I think people familiar with our podcast understand that I have a media background in that I work currently in newspapers, and that kind of I lean on that experience a bit. Phil actually works for the same company as I do. We're not really coworkers because we work in different offices in different parts of the country, but I had been following his work a little bit in the last few months, and I thought, what would be great is to have someone else with kind of a similar background to me to come onto the show and we could talk about wrestling media and kind of some of the trends and themes and our thoughts about it. And so I'm really excited to have Phil on the show today. Phil, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Nice to meet you. And like you said, we're in different parts of the country, work for the same company, but amazing how we can all still come together.
Yeah, it's funny because I was like, sorry, I just want to switch this. But I was actually conversing with you on Twitter, and I was like, hey, Phil, my name's Jesse Collins. I got this podcast. We talk about wrestling media. Would you be interested in coming on? And then we were kind of going back and forth, kind of discussing it. And I said, full disclosure, I work for Gannett too. I work for USA Today as well. And you're like, really? And so it's just kind of a funny coincidence. And so I guess for starters, just real basic, what I kind of wanted to look at was kind of compare our experience to a degree in traditional media, working in newspapers, working for digital online platforms as well, and kind of how that relates to our experiences, both participating in and observing wrestling media. Real quick, could you kind of talk around like that kind of your experience, kind of mixing those two things?
Sure. Well, I mean, they've kind of always crossed over for me, at least for a large chunk of my career. I was a sports writer for 10 years before I moved into other managerial roles and other digital roles and things like that in the company. But very, very early on, my employer was like, okay, blogs are the direction everything is going, and we should talk about generating blogs. So my boss came to me at the time, I guess this was 2007 or something like that, and wanted to see if I wanted to develop a wrestling blog. So I'd always been doing, Under the Ring was a wrestling blog back then, but it was also, an entree for me into covering wrestling, through traditional legacy media. Kind of got away from it the last several years, as I honestly just didn't even have time to do it anymore. And also the platforms changed multiple times and I wasn't keeping up with them. But really wanted to dive back into it with the podcast, something I really always wanted to do. So I just kind of picked up the same branding and did that. So really almost the whole time I've done reporting, editing, or other things, otherwise, I've always kind of had at least a little bit of, entry into the pro wrestling world. As you do stuff, you gain contacts over time, and, I've never really lost those. But yeah, it's always kind of been this dual world for me of doing the real life job, and then also kind of weaving wrestling into it and having people be like, "Why are you doing this?" So, it's fun and it's interesting. But you could, to your point, you could use a lot of the same skills that you use. It is the same skill set as long as you're approaching wrestling from a journalistic standpoint. Nothing really changes too much.
Yeah, and so one of like my central thesis about wrestling media in a lot of ways is, and you kind of touched on it, kind of going through your history of how you started incorporating kind of like your interest in wrestling into your regular traditional legacy media job. And it is that wrestling had never really gotten a ton of mainstream media publicity before the internet was really around. They had, there were articles and results run in newspapers and everything like that, but there's a lot of discussion about whether that was worked. The promoter would call in and tell the newspapers, who won each match and kind of things like that. They weren't really covering wrestling the same way that they would cover the Major League Baseball team or college sports in town or things like that. And I think that explains kind of a lot of how we have gotten to the wrestling media landscape that we're at today, because wrestling media was contained, serious wrestling media that was, wrestling, that or media that was critical of wrestling, media that evaluated it, was kind of restricted to fan magazines and zines and newsletters and things like the Wrestling Observer newsletter. And there are so many newsletters that existed in the 60s and 70s and 80s that don't exist anymore today. Magazines like Pro Wrestling Illustrated and things like that. And really, so like, it's funny, you mentioned like in the mid 2000s, blogs start taking off. Really, they start taking off kind of in the late 90s. And those become the formative spots for, I think, like mass media looking at not just pro wrestling, but kind of anything that was considered niche pop culture. Alternative music's, reviews, alternative movie, independent movie culture, comic books, video games, all those kind of really start taking off from a media perspective in the late 90s and early 2000s, as the fan base is able to be reached on the internet and kind of prove to people that there's a large group of people who are interested in reading news about this subject, which maybe didn't exist in older legacy media because they were more narrow-minded on it. And I think that plays a role in how people view wrestling media today, because it, especially as far as mainstream media goes and as far as legacy media goes, it never really looked at pro wrestling. But at the same time, go ahead.
I was going to say it did, but it did it in different ways. At the time that my blog launched, I was one of, at least on my count, at least 3 wrestling newspaper blogs in the country. The other 2, one was Kevin Eck, who actually went on to work for Ring of Honor. He had one with the Baltimore Sun. And then Alfonso Castillo had one for Newsday that some other people contributed to too. I think Seth Mates, who was part of the WWE creative team for a little while, might have contributed to that one too. But even so, like the Wrestling Observer newsletter itself was sort of born out of the fact that Frank DeFord had the Sports Daily newspaper in the 80s, and they had a wrestling column, and Dave Meltzer wrote it. So it really was in mainstream media. But the issue is that a lot of mainstream media includes people who don't understand why wrestling is important to cover. Like there are tons of people within the media industry who really, really love wrestling, but it depends on where your decision makers are, of whether or not it's going to get through to a certain level or not. Selling somebody on a wrestling story is the worst. It is so bad, and I've had to do it so many times. It's just not fun, especially if the person has no knowledge of why somebody would care. Like, who's your audience for? Well, I don't know. Like, I just want to write about this local guy who's wrestling. I don't know. But, it's not fun.
Right. We talk about like people in editorial positions or higher up in media, media executives. What is their understanding of pro wrestling? Whether, even if they're not a fan, are they skeptical of it? Do they think it's just the lowest form of entertainment? It's just trash that we're not going to include in our esteemed publication. And there are a lot of people that think that.
And I've even gone back through, because I have access to like the newspaper.com site for Poughkeepsie specifically. I'll go with that. Poughkeepsie is a great wrestling town. It's had a lot of history for a very long time, with the Mid-Hudson Civic Center, or the former Mid-Hudson Civic Center, right across the street from here. But when you go through the old clippings, it runs the gamut of the different ways that different reporters approached covering it. Like there was I don't know who the promoter was. It seemed like it was WWF, because the talent was the same. But throughout the 50s and 60s, there was an annual show outdoors in Poughkeepsie that was a wrestling show. And when you go through each of the year's write-ups, it depends on who went, of whether you're getting tongue in cheek, or whether you're getting like just straight results, whether you're getting like a photo essay with a couple of lines. Like it was so inconsistent. But it was funny because it looked like they got pressure to cover it every year. They always did it, but they never ever did it the same any particular year. So I think that's the thing. It always depended on who was trying to get the coverage in, whether it was driven by staff, whether it was driven by a promoter who had a a contact at the publication, that kind of stuff. So I think that's really the history of wrestling media in a nutshell. It's inconsistent, but people want publicity, and they know where to find the people who can help them a little bit.
Yeah, and it's been that way pretty much for all of wrestling's existence. You can go back to news reports from the 1800s where someone was covering wrestling and they're talking about how they think it was fixed. And like there, you can go back, like if you go back like turn of the century and then like the first half of the 20th century, you'll get, I think, a little bit actually more I think they were a little bit more respectful of pro wrestling in the sense that it was covered the same way that they might cover boxing if it was big in the community. I mean, I've done research on my own of wrestling in the Boston area in the first half of the 20th century, where Boston was kind of for a period of time like the most successful wrestling territory under Paul Bowser.
Yeah.
And, you can read the Boston Globe and see like, they had real reports of what was going on. And there's stories about traffic jams backed up for miles because people were trying to get to Fenway Park to see Dano O'Mahony versus Jim Londos.
Wow.
But I think in the modern media environment, pro wrestling coverage kind of has evolved, didn't have the kind of backbone, I think, from legacy media to establish, I think, a series of standards for how it was going to be covered. In the same way that when I don't think pro wrestling is covered now that much differently than the way like Major League Baseball is covered in a lot of ways. Like obviously there's more people covering baseball, but baseball you have, obviously mainstream sources that are covering it and talking about the results, but you also have a lot of different spin-offs and blogs and fan articles and, deep analysts and all these things like that. And I think pro wrestling has all of those things too. But what pro wrestling doesn't have is a 100+ years of media coverage and kind of a standardization of what people expect when they get wrestling coverage. And what that ends up happening, Phil, is you get a really wide variety of how people are going to cover pro wrestling. And you still have people who will cover it almost entirely from a kayfabe perspective. And you'll get people who are not covering it from a kayfabe perspective, but also phenomenally uncritical of anything that's happening. And you'll get people who are very critical of things that are happening. And it doesn't feel like there's a kind of a uniform standard for how we talk about pro wrestling and how it should be covered. And, in a lot of ways, that's a good thing because it allows room for experimentation and allows room for different opinions and people to be able to find the kind of coverage that they enjoy. But at the same time, I think it's wrestling media's credibility in the eyes of the average fan because there isn't that kind of long-standing standard that exists for fans.
Yeah, I think the first problem with people and wrestling media is that there's an automatic gut reaction right now in media in general to just lump everybody in every category. Like, oh, like, gosh, this wrestling media, you can't trust them for anything. And it's like, well, that covers like so many people that it's ridiculous. So unless you're going to be specific, both for wrestlers and for fans, I'll say too, unless you're going to be really specific about what you're seeing that you think isn't accurate, I think the thing that needs to drive it, the heart of everything is the truth. Like that needs to be what leads anything, but I think some of the, some of the base for where things got to today is kind of based on some of the stuff that maybe historians did over the last 100 years too, because I think a lot of the best work that was being done was done by historians that people probably weren't even reading, so the reason that a lot of the lessons you can learn for wrestling now exist is because of the work that some of those people were doing. It does run the gamut though, but it's similar. And I don't follow this stuff quite as much, but my friends who do tell me this, that it's very similar to the way comic books are covered. And it's very similar to the way that movies are covered, where you have your, really smart people who know the industry and know how to break it down. And then you've got your fan culture that just kind of takes over too. And it's just, oh, I hate that they did this. They shouldn't have done this. They should just do this. It's like you get that in wrestling constantly. You could find any take out there for any booking decision that's made right now, of a positive or a negative. So I think it's just that weird marriage of the fan culture and, kind of like you said, the punditry, the straight news, which you need too. And you need people that are holding some of these places accountable, because there's a lot of money in there, a lot of money involved in pro wrestling. But I think it's okay. I, I have a lot of respect for a guy like Mike Johnson, who does what he does on a regular basis. I think he is respected within the field. I think he has a lot of sources because he's earned them. I think he does a good job, and he kind of tends to steer clear of giving his opinion, which he probably has tons of them, because he's been around for a while. But then, somebody like Dave Meltzer, when he's breaking something down, what people have a hard time with Dave is knowing, it's kind of the same way that people have a hard time watching cable news right now. They are consuming something that has the fact, but then also it happens in all cross news right now. There's also that instant analysis factor where, in order to properly frame what's happening, he needs to explain how it affects everything else. And in order to do that, he has to give an opinion. So he's sort of giving you news analysis, in the moment sometimes even too. And people don't like that sometimes. But, if there's anybody that's, like capable and also, should be doing that, it's probably him, because he's been around for so long. So I think it's just, and I think in general right now, and I know a lot of other people talked about this recently, it's a lack of media literacy that really is at the root of a lot of what people have a hard time with wrestling media, because a lot of people some people just get stuck on Dave's star ratings, which is just absurd as it is, because he doesn't even care that much. But like, it's understanding what's news analysis, what's just copy paste garbage, what's just not credible at all, what's just bad faith actors who are posing as news and aren't really contributing anything to the ecosystem, I guess you could say. So there's just so much of it out there. And then there's just people too that are just I've seen too, where people are like hosts and don't consider themselves like journalists necessarily, but they're content creators, which is a new one in this landscape too. But what they're doing basically, when you watch it, is basically journalism, but they don't think they're doing journalism. So yeah,
I think
there's a lot to digest there.
I think people use the well, I'm not a journalist line as a defense mechanism to avoid criticism. Personally, I think I'm kind of the belief that, like, kind of, if you're sharing news, if you're retweeting something, you're kind of being a journalist, because you
have a responsibility.
Yeah, you're spreading news information, and you should have the responsibility, right, of, if you're going to retweet something, if you're going to make a comment on something, if you're going to present it somewhere, you have some responsibility into at least believing that the information that you're displaying is credible. I kind of wanted to touch on, like, so Sean Ross Sapp he said this before, and I think it's very poignant, is he says, like, if you're going to do what he does, if you're going to run a wrestling news site, you have to wear many hats. Yep. You have to be an editor, you have to be a reporter, you have to be an analyst, you have to be a pundit, you have to be a social media coordinator, you have to do all of these things. And I think a lot of people have a hard time digesting that. And you mentioned Dave's star ratings, right? Dave's star ratings are probably the most famous thing that he has, in the sense that the general wrestling fan base knows him the most from the star ratings. They maybe
the least important thing that he does.
Right, and he'll say that it's the least important thing he does, but it's by far, like, the people who don't know anything about Dave Meltzer, or at least familiar with his star ratings. And that's one of those things where it's just like, so Dave becomes famous to these people for his opinion, as opposed to what his real fame is from, which is from running a newsletter for 30 plus years, or 40 years now.
Yep.
And so I think a lot of people don't understand that. And, it's hard for people, like you said, media literacy is low. I think some people enjoy mixing in their own opinions with news. I think a lot of people maybe don't understand, the people who are doing it maybe don't understand, like, the clearest way on how to do that, because it can be difficult to kind of, this is my opinion, this is news, this is my opinion, this is news. I think a savvy enough listener or reader, and me and you, Phil, have experience in the news industry, so we're probably not the best examples,
right?
But I can listen to anybody pretty much and know what is just by, what is a factual statement in news they're imprinting and what is their opinion. But maybe the average person struggles to do that. And then social media amplifies that. It's funny you mentioned, like, so you have all these people, like if you just go on Twitter, right, and you have, you'll have Dave and you'll have Sean Ross Sapp and you'll have Wade Keller and John Pollock and Mike Johnson, although Mike Johnson's not really on Twitter, but
he does a good job of avoiding it.
Right. Mike's an interesting one because he avoids the punditry like a ton, and to the degree that I know nothing about Mike Johnson. I don't know what his opinions are on pro wrestling. I don't know where he lives. I don't know any of these things about him. All I know is that when PW Insider has a scoop, it's reliable information and it's probably accurate. But
I sat next to him for an entire show a few months ago.
I don't know what he looks. I don't know what he looks like.
I got to hear a little bit of it at the MLW show at the Melrose Ballroom because I sat right next to him. I hadn't seen him in a while, but he knows his stuff and people trust him. And honestly, like, he came up through the whole ECW kind of scene back in the 90s. So the people who were around it back then know him. A lot of them know people. I mean, he's legit, and the people know to contact him when they have something, and they trust him because he's good at his job.
Well, and so you have like what I would consider like the real reporters, newsbreakers in wrestling on social media, and then you have everyone else, and that everyone else includes fans who run blogs, people like me. I don't really consider myself a reporter. I never break news in wrestling.
Either.
I occasionally hear stuff. I'd say I'm closer to analyst work. And I'll do research work, and I'll do a lot of like op-eds and things like that. But I don't really consider myself a reporter. But you have people like me, other fans, people, fan sites, anonymous accounts, whatever. You have all these other people. And a lot of times the general public will lump in the opinions of all of these other people and consider all wrestling media and then paint with a broad brush. You'll see a news story that comes out that's a rumor, a baseless rumor that will appear on social media. Let's do Bobby Fish was contacted by Triple H and tried to convince Adam Cole and Kyle O'Reilly that they should get out of their contracts with AEW and go to NXT. A baseless rumor that formed, I think, first on a message board and then spread around social media. None of these, Dave never said it was true. Sean, I don't think ever said it was true. None of the confirmed real reporters said it was true, but it spread around social media. Then it came out that it wasn't true, and there was no real evidence of it being true. But then you have a ton of people who
are in those dirt sheets.
Yeah, exactly. And they'll say, you can't trust them at all. And it's like, well, hold on a second. It's not just, okay, one media person got it wrong. Let's paint the whole, everyone with the broad brush. It's the media is not even participating in this. It's totally fan driven and troll accounts and all of these things that are magnifying a story that isn't real. And then that is projected back onto the wrestling media.
I think what's great is I think I managed to miss that one entirely. I didn't even hear about that.
Yeah,
one.
I mean, that will happen too. Is that like, what was the big one that was, do you remember a few months ago? Do you remember Buff Bagwell's Twitter thing where like Buff Bagwell suddenly became like extremely left-leaning progressive on Twitter?
Sort of, yeah.
Was like getting a lot of like respect from the Twitter people for saying he supports gay rights and things like that.
It sounded like it was some sort of there was some sort of issue with the guy that was running his account.
Right. Well, what it turned out that wasn't Buff Bagwell who was running the account, and that it was like someone he had hired to run his account for him, who was like under the auspices of Buff Bagwell tweeting, was saying all these things that would like get him over with like the progressive left wrestling fan base on Twitter. And then everyone's like, I can't believe Buff Bagwell. And I was like, I missed this. Like, because I'm not following Buff Bagwell on Twitter. So
it might even be, because I don't know. I've never spoken to Buff Bagwell. ever, it might be that, like, and everybody's probably attacking him at that point too. Like, how can this happen? It's not really him. It's like, he might be a perfectly reasonable guy if he was actually just running his own Twitter account. We don't know that. He didn't have an opportunity to even show you.
Yeah. I think what ended up happening was the guy who was running his Twitter account, I think maybe had some legal issues maybe or something like that.
I think there was something of there seemed like some sort of a crossroads there where all of a sudden it just blew up. And I don't even think Buff kind of even knew what was occurring.
He was giving a guy a few bucks to try to get him over on social media, probably try to get him some bookings or signing somewhere.
Yeah, and I think that it seemed like they were working together at times, because there were also photos and stuff of him at, some of the things he was at, some of the fans he was meeting at that time. But yeah, that was bizarre. And but that kind of stuff blows up so easily on Twitter's the worst. I mean, it's great because you can also use it to promote everything that's going on. It's a great link to be able to meet and talk to people who have interest in the same stuff as you, but it's also everyone's published gut reactions to everything. Mm-hmm. So you have to take some responsibility of, I like to wait before I hit the send button a lot, just because I don't want to put something out into the world that I then regret like 25 seconds later. So but
definitely a lot of highlighting everything I just wrote and pressing backspace, because I'm like, do I really want to send this out to the
and a lot of times, like, one of the reasons I didn't want to, like, somebody asked me about, when my podcast was starting, like what I was going to cover, and I was like, well, what I don't want to do is recaps, because everybody does those. Right. Like, you could find better ones, and like, I don't even care what I think about what happened on the show, so how am I supposed to make anybody else care? Like, it's just, a lot of times I'll watch a show and I'll try to stay off Twitter entirely, because I find myself when I'm watching the show that I'm not paying attention to the show if I have my phone in my hand. So I want to watch the show and then come up with my opinion afterwards.
I find out having my opinions morphed almost sometimes, whether it's on Twitter. We have a one of the sites I work for, we have a Slack channel where everyone kind of watches and gives their opinions. And I find out myself, sometimes I'm like, I don't want to look at this because I want to have my own original opinion of this match or this segment. Yeah. And because I find myself sometimes being influenced by other people.
Other people have told me, and some negative people in wrestling have told me, that like sometimes talking to me gets them off the ledge, kind of, because I am notoriously I have it in my Twitter little thing at the top too, that I call myself the glass half full guy, because every time something happens and everyone is freaking out on Twitter about it in wrestling, I'm always the guy who was like, well, yeah, but what if this happens out of that? And like, I'm always the one giving the best case scenario of what could happen with the angle rather than the worst case scenario. And sometimes I'm the only one doing that. So, I've had people texting me during the shows like, oh my God, I can't believe it, especially during some of the, older WWE stuff. It's like, no, this isn't really that bad. Not a big deal, whatever.
Well, if you're going to be, if you're going to be more conservative in your take than the rest of social media, in the sense that you're not going to overreact immediately to something, if you're going to be a little bit slower to kind of declare something good or bad, you're probably going to be right more often in the long run, because it's such an instant reaction place. And I think we're all guilty of it at certain times. There are certainly some things that I have said that I was like, this is terrible. I was like, actually, this has been saved. But you know what? That's great content. You know what? There's few columns I like to write more than the column that is, at one time I thought this, and then this happened, and then now I think this, because I think it's really an impactful way to tell a story about how something's evolved and developed into something that you didn't think was going to happen.
I don't think fans think about the big picture enough when they consume wrestling content. I think just think
the instant
there's a really big picture that everything fits into. And when you're watching one isolated show, there's no way to fit it into that a lot. So what I try to do is I try to think about the whole landscape and where it's going and where it could go and what the possibilities are, rather than just, I liked this or I didn't like this. I can do, I like this and I didn't like this with matches mostly. But, a lot of times I don't want to be the guy that just says, we'll just let it play out, because that's not fair. Like, you can't do that all the time. But like, for me, I always just try to like logically, I am a creature of logic. Everything needs to make sense to me. So I always try to make sense of everything that I see in wrestling.
Well, I think just in general, like the environment of the instant reaction of the the gotta give out my thoughts on Twitter on whatever this last match or segment was. I think that conditions people to kind of avoid seeing the big picture. And I wrote an article for WrestleNomics a couple of like last month that was just looking at and it was titled like the way we discuss and watch wrestling is wrong. In that if you really break it down, it's kind of ridiculous to overanalyze everything that happens on a wrestling show when most of the time none of these things are happening in a vacuum. They're happening over the course of weeks or months or sometimes years of storyline development. And it's hard to say this, this angle was bad, this angle was good. Certain stuff in a vacuum, there can be a good match, there can be a bad match, there can be a good promo that's entertaining to watch, there can be a bad promo. But making anything too declarative about a long-term storyline without really giving it a chance to kind of play out to a degree is you're gonna be wrong and you're gonna be incorrect and you're not going to be able, you're gonna be ignorant of the big picture.
I watched some terrible Nitros and Thunders that I could find things that I liked on them, and I didn't really necessarily like the episodes or where any of it went at all. Then I'll think back to something like Retribution, which was the angle on Raw in the summer of 2020 that led to Mustafa Ali and Dijak and Shane Thorne and all those guys as the Antifa sort of thing that they were doing. And I just said from the get-go, I said, I don't see this going anywhere positive for anybody. And then, just over time, it was like this literally set back at least 5 or 6 talents, like 6 to 12 months each of their careers, because it was that terrible and it had no direction.
And you could tell right away. And sometimes that's true. Like the let it play out. I feel like when people say let it play out, that's like an encouragement to like just turn your brain off and accept what's going to happen and don't have an opinion. And I don't want to tell people to not have an opinion or not have an instant reaction necessarily, but it's more of to avoid general declaration of things. And we have that so often after every episode. Doesn't matter what it is. It can be Raw, it can be Dynamite, it can be SmackDown, it can be Rampage.
I just don't get upset about wrestling.
People
like that's my thing. And I don't think people can understand why. Of like, well, I like watching it. There's things on it that I'm gonna like or not like, and I go into it knowing that. And I used to freak out more about wrestling. I used to nitpick every single segment, but it doesn't matter. Like social media makes it, every single segment matters so much more. But like it really there are some rotten episodes of Monday Night Raw that I probably watched like 20 years ago that I freaked out about, but it didn't mean anything in the long run for where we are 22 years later. Not really.
I like I did not like the Saraya segment on Dynamite this week.
Yeah.
So I didn't
break this apart, but I didn't either.
All right. But okay. So like we both
didn't probably different reasons though. I bet
we both didn't like it, right? But I'm not ready to say I don't think Saraya is going to work in AEW.
No,
I don't
you can't.
think that this is going to work. But some people will say that, so that the jump to the conclusion will be like, this segment didn't work, therefore this is a big mistake. I can't believe how much money Tony Khan's paying. What a waste! Like all these things like that. Like it's 1 week. Like we have to now. If that segment if something like that segment is taking place every week for the next few months, then you can start saying like this isn't working out. But to say it after 1 week is ridiculous. I mean, we have seen there's been plenty of people in AEW who have come in with some hype, really struggle to get off the ground, but then eventually kind of find their mark. They had like 5 managers with Andrade before they were figured out that he actually doesn't need one at all.
He just needs Mr. the assistant. But with Saraya's thing, obviously they're making somewhat of an investment in her. So, basing the opinion of it off of 1 or 2 appearances is kind of pointless, because it's not, it's not going to be the grand scheme right off the bat. Nothing she said really led to much of anything. When you cut a promo about change and then the only thing that really happens is a lumberjack match, like that doesn't really do anything for me. The other thing that killed me in that segment too, and she kind of explained it a little bit more today on social media too, but like I messaged a friend of mine and I said, oh, hold on a minute. Like, oh, my boss actually listens to me. I said, well, wait, she was in WWE that long, and won the title on her first night on the main roster, was like a main character on NXT for a while, then was also on multiple seasons of Total Divas, and then stayed in the company and was paid even after she was injured for 5 straight years. I was like, what is her problem with WWE exactly? Like, because this sounds like it's a pretty good deal that she had going on there. But she kind of even said today, I mean, I think she was just saying it to say it, she's in AEW now and you got to say what you got to say. But one of the things that bugged me the most about that segment, more than even her stuff in it, was that the one person that the crowd, and last week in Queens when I was there too, really was wanting to see in better stuff was Jamie Hayter, who was the only person in the segment that was run off to the dressing room like a coward by Willow Nightingale, who I'm not even positive is under contract. So my big thing there was like, the fans are telling you, we want Jamie Hayter, and you're not doing anything with it. So that was where I had.
Well, Phil, I would say do not have that instant reaction that they're not doing anything with Jamie Hayter. I would say that they're likely that was an angle to set up Jamie Hayter versus Willow Nightingale soon.
Well, it was on Rampage. I think they wrestled tonight.
So it was.
When we're recording this,
but I mean, I didn't really want to review the segment. To me, it felt like she was cutting like a WWE promo circa 2015. And
I think a large chunk of that Dynamite episode was that sort of thing. Was they were trying to reset things a little bit for all the changes that they just had to basically make. So
right.
I can't, that segment, like I did text somebody right after watching that segment, because he texted me and said, hey, I want to know what you thought of this right after you watch it. I'm like, all right, fine. And I was like, well, I have like 17 notes if you really want them right now.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask you about these. I've talked about them on this podcast a lot. In my last episode, Nick Hausman, we talked about them, where the media calls and the scrums. That AEW obviously has both the media calls and the scrums. WWE has not had the media calls return, but that was something that Triple H did a lot before NXT takeovers, and presumably we might see them come back. And they actually did have some form of press conference after the Clash at the Castle show. So whether that's something that happens going forward or not, we have no idea. But I was interested to kind of know about how you feel about the media calls and the scrums, and kind of what you're seeing from the company's end, and also kind of the various types of media members that show up at these scrums. I've given my opinions on them before.
Yeah.
So I'd be interested in hearing what you have to say about it.
My main take on it is that the more participation you can encourage around the media to kind of rally around your company is probably the better. I will say that, while WWE doesn't always do scrums, or they definitely don't even do scrums, but they did do those calls for a while. One thing they have done, especially in association with some of their bigger shows, is they'll do sort of a media day ahead of it sometimes, where people can interview different talents and stuff like that. I participated in the one. Actually, it aired on, or it wasn't Peacock then, it was WWE Network, but the WrestleMania 30 press conference was at the Hard Rock Cafe down in New York City, and I was at there. And it's not on Peacock now, but every time I reacted to something, I sat right next to the camera, didn't know. So every time they did something, my facial reaction to everything was on the WWE Network. That's where I got a Twitter avatar for a little while. So, but also that day, I interviewed Michael Cole that day, because he is local to my coverage area. And he was, I'd interviewed him before when he did the match with Lawler too. I think that was before that. I'm trying to remember the time frame of that. But they made anybody available who you needed to, like, basically that day, hey, you want 20 minutes of Michael Cole, you got it. You showed up. So WWE is always very good with media regarding that stuff when they need to set stuff up around rallying around a big event or something like that. I think I like the idea very much of the media calls, because I think anytime you have some additional access, transparency, you can directly ask the person making the decisions for why they did what they did. I think that's always a positive. I think on some of the calls now, both WWE wise, when they were doing it for NXT and AEW, they include a lot of different types of media, some of whom I'm not familiar with at all. That doesn't mean they're not credible. I just don't know who they are sometimes. So I think I think they might go a little bit overboard with the invites, but that's not for me to decide. That's for their PR person to decide, and for really the public to decide when they consume it. Uh, I really like the idea of the scrums after pay-per-views. I think I think what happened with the last one obviously put a bad taste in some people's mouth, but I don't think they should go 2
It was the
hours.
most
Like
exciting thing ever. I mean, if you're a fan, you should be
yeah,
craving more of those.
I turned it on just because I was like, I was off the next day because it was Labor Day. And I was like, oh, you know what? Let me just see what this is. Let me see what's on there. And then I have it on, and it was right in the middle of, do you do who do you do improv with? And I was like, wait, what the hell? What is he talking about right now? And then I just left it on. I was like, I can't believe this is occurring. Like, what? First of all, also, why did I put this on a whim? Like live. I was like, what is happening here? But I think it's good to have those relationships. It's good to understand. It's good for the wrestlers to see the people who cover them. It's good for the people who cover them to not just be sitting at a computer and doing it out. You know, it's good to get out and interact. It's good to see. It's good to learn who people are. It's good to establish sources. It's good to establish relationships. It's good for the Tony Khans and the Paul Levesques of the world to understand where people are coming from and why they're asking the questions that they are. You know, I've done media scrums for other things like basketball and, you know, other sports and stuff like that. And, you know, the more you know, the thing is, bad questions are not exclusive to wrestling media scrums. I could honestly tell you, I've been in some terrible media scrums in my life where I'm like, God, that was terrible. But like, it's not my question, so you know, if it drags it down, it stinks. But what are you going to do about it? Also, like if you're on a deadline, you just need things to move too. That can be frustrating too. But yeah, I mean, you watch some pro sports media scrums nowadays. Some of them are terrible. You know, it's the quality of who's in it. So, but I think all of it's positive. I don't think any of it should go away, and I think WWE should bring them back for. I would love the media calls before pay-per-views. I think for the big four, I think you gotta. I think it makes sense. You're in big cities, you're doing stadium shows or whatever. Might as well. I don't know what their comfort level is going to be with it though.
Yeah, and so with AEW, at least, like I think we talked about this off air, but like AEW and Tony have really embraced wrestling media, as opposed to, in a lot of ways, WWE has kept the wrestling media kind of at arm's length when it comes to working with them with coverage and things like that. They crave mainstream media. They almost, in a lot of ways, think that they're better than wrestling media. And so I think with the media calls and scrums, the key for both when Tony Khan is doing them and when Triple H was doing them and presumably might do them in the future, is you're talking to, like you said, the person who makes those big decisions. You might interview a WWE talent, but you kind of got to ask them questions that kind of pertain to their career and things like that for the most part, as opposed to Tony Khan is the judge, jury, and executioner in AEW. He's in charge of everything. Any question that you have about AEW, you can ask Tony, and presumably you can ask Triple H because he's now the Vince McMahon of it. And I think that's really powerful. It's powerful to have those kind of connections with people. It's important that we have these public gatherings for everyone to see. I mean, the CM Punk press conference, it's very different that he did that in front of the world, because there were people, they were live streaming it and in front of a bunch of media members, and as opposed to, he could have done that in a pre-taped sit down interview with a media partner. He could have done that with a phone interview with somebody. Like, he could have just went off and then you couldn't cover it because he can't, like, all this stuff could have happened. It happened for the world to see. There was no way to hide what this guy was doing and what this guy was saying. And there was incredible transparency in it. And I thought that was very powerful. And I've said before, like, it's good for, if you're in the wrestling media and you have an opportunity to not even go to the media scrums, just go to an episode of Dynamite. And they'll sit you in the section with the other wrestling media people. I don't know if you've done this, Phil, but I've done it a few times. It's great because you just see other local people that are in wrestling media. You talk to them. I met Josh Nason, who I didn't even know lived locally near me, but Josh Nason of Figure Four and Wrestling Observer
Yep.
online. I sat right next to him. We hit it off for like 3 hours. We've appeared on a show a few times. Like, you just meet new people. It's a great opportunity to network. Covering wrestling and being a wrestling media member is often very isolating. You can feel like you're only doing it by yourself because everyone's doing it digitally. But there's a real camaraderie, and I think the press conferences for AEW, I think are improving. I think
Yeah.
people are getting more, the regular people who are attending are getting more comfortable. I think they're asking much better questions. You're still going to have people who are going to ask kayfabe questions. You're going to have some people who are asking just random questions. Like it's never going to be perfect, but I do think it's improved a lot. And I think you're getting people asking follow-up questions if they don't feel like another question was asked accurately. People are talking to each other. Oh, what are you going to ask? Okay, you're going to ask about that. I'm going to ask about this then. So like seriously, and that's all really important stuff to get the most out of these events.
I'll give AWPR credit. I mean, I do deal with them for my show also, for guests and things, but they've obviously done a good job of structuring them because they're not that Punk one was a lot of things, but it didn't run 2.5, 3 hours too. So they kind of kept everything on schedule, cycle people in and out, got people in and out as they needed to and stuff like that. Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think. Ring of Honor's show, the Ring of Honor New Japan show at Madison Square Garden,
Right.
the WrestleMania weekend. What's funny about that is, so I wanted to do a little bit of media stuff then. Also, like I know Matt Taven a little bit because he used to do shows here for
he's a local guy here.
Northeast Wrestling. He was I know Matt, period. So I honestly, he was in the Ring of Honor title match at Madison Square Garden. I went over to the theater that day to just see if I could run into Matt, shoot a quick video with him, and just move on with my life. So I do that, and then I ran into Mark Kruskal, who used to do a bunch of PR for Ring of Honor, now does stuff with the NWA. But he was like, "Hey, we're doing a whole media day right now. Do you want to participate?" And I was like, "Oh, I didn't realize this was happening." So I just done some stuff at MLW the night before. They had a show. It was the day before their Battle Riot. It was the other one, but I was like, yeah, I wasn't anticipating. I had a friend with me at the time too. I had my bag with me. I wasn't wearing a nice shirt. I had to put a shirt on, but I was wearing like some sort of old T-shirt or something. And I was like,
at least if you had a shirt to put on, that's lucky.
Yeah, I had it in my bag and I just put it on over my T-shirt. But so then they cycled in the Briscoes and Dalton Castle and Jay Lethal and Kelly Klein and some other people. And it was, like you said, it was a nice experience. There were a whole bunch of different, since it was WrestleMania weekend, there were a bunch of different wrestling media around too. Wrestling media is media, like I don't really differentiate it much with what mainstream is, because in that case, like, yeah, some mainstream people are going to be in there, but for the most part, the people who care about wrestling and are covering it in the mainstream are generally wrestling fans anyway. And you could, Jay Reddick from Orlando Sentinel, give a shout out to. I know him from doing MLW stuff. Again, a traditional media guy who just likes writing about wrestling on the side and has some contacts. So, you run into a lot of the same people. They're fun to, it's fun when you see them. Scott Fishman, all those different types of guys. Like you see them around there, and, they're all normal guys. They're all normal people. I think John Pollock I've run across a couple times. Denise Salcedo probably doesn't even remember this, but she was at the Ring of Honor one that I was at too. But it's just it's good to see everybody. It's good to see the way people are working, see the way you're working, see how they are, and see what might work for you, what doesn't work for you. The way you get better at any media is by observing other people and figuring out your own path. That's always the way I've taken it. And even in some of the stuff I was doing in sports, because I followed Meltzer obviously forever, and just the way that he approaches wrestling is kind of the same way I kind of wanted to approach some of the beats that I was on, to just be like, okay, I am the authority on this. In my case, it was high school sports, so it was a little bit different of a topic. But like, I want to know everything that's going on. I want to know who all the important power players are. I want to know who the ADs are, and I want to know who the coaches are. I want to know who the people making decisions in the stadiums are. You know, you really need to work a whole area to really own a beat. And I feel like he's got ownership of that beat. There's no doubt about it. He's been doing it for 50 years, whatever it's been. But that to me is the best thing. Is like when you kind of just see the different ways that people work, see what you want to do, and see what you want to avoid completely. But I think the more access people get is going to definitely be to the positive. As long as the public is willing to consume it, you're going to see it continue.
Right. And I think the public and fans play probably in a lot of ways the most critical role in this whole thing, because they have to, this is true across all media, but the public, if you work in media, there's often a frustration that the general public is not recognizing what is like real news work and what isn't. And I think we talked about that earlier with like social media and the way things start trending. And it's like, it doesn't have to be a confirmed story to start trending and to start reflecting negatively on wrestling media. And I think the public has to play a really big role in what we see going forward. If they consume wrestling coverage from mainstream media sources, those mainstream media sources will likely dedicate more resources to wrestling coverage. And I think that would be a great thing. I was going to ask you, what do you think about the mainstream media coverage of wrestling? What do you think about WWE's use of corporate partnerships? They have they have a corporate deal with the Ringer, which I find very fascinating for a number of reasons. And we've seen like they have, not necessarily, they had the whole thing with Fox Sports and Ryan Satin. They use Ariel Helwani in BT Sport as kind of their British television partner. They make a lot of use out of these partnerships with either television companies or, in the case of the Ringer, a media company, to, in a lot of ways, sometimes, obviously promote their product, also gain favorable press.
I don't know if it's always that, and I don't know if it's as strategic as that. I think it's a lot looser than you realize sometimes. I think it's more, you watch an episode of SmackDown and something big like Logan Paul, getting his match upcoming at Crown Jewel against Roman Reigns comes up. And then what they want to show is they want to show all the different national media outlets that had a headline on it. They'll run through a cycle of like 8 or 9. I'm always interested to see which ones make the cut. On NXT, they were doing that a little bit, and they were doing it with wrestling media. And some of the ones that made the cut, I was like, no, not Ringside News. What are you doing? Cut it out. But not to say anything about them, but
I think you just did.
Yeah, I did. I don't care. But it's a lot of time, like BT Sport is a partner of theirs. So if they could say, hey, we want to offer you this access. Well, BT Sport's not going to say, Ariel Helwani's not going to say no. He's got content to make. I think where it becomes weird is where they go out and they specifically ask for the like exclusives. But I think sometimes you see that in news too, and you also have to kind of vet what you want to do and what you don't want to do. Like there's times where I've seen news stories where it's like, okay, this is going to be announced in a press release at 10. We can let you know what's going to happen as long as you don't break the embargo for when the news comes out, for when we're putting it out. We'll give
this
it to
is standard across all news.
Right. And what you have to weigh as an editor at that point is, okay, is what they're telling me so urgent that I need to get it out to market before the embargo? Like, do I want to actually agree to the embargo first? And then like, all right, well, what can we actually do with this? Because if somebody is offering you an exclusive, well, that's nice, like it's nice to have. I think WWE's done a good job of identifying who they want to do that with a little bit better. I've never been that person. I've never been offered that opportunity ever. But, it's interesting to me to see where it comes from at times. The Ringer seems to be doing some more stuff, but the Ringer's doing some stuff with AEW right now too.
Well, the Ringer has an exclusive deal with WWE for exclusive information. that's public knowledge, and it's at the top of all of the Ringer articles. It says the Ringer has a deal with WWE
Interesting.
for this
But
stuff.
that's
So
interesting too, that they are also producing things on AEW in the meantime too.
right, they're not necessarily, this is very fascinating to me, is that they're not necessarily ignoring AEW, but at the same time, it does bring in a lot of ethical questions about how, when we see criticism of WWE, how realistic is that? When we see their audio feed and what they're discussing, who can we really consider as a credible source at this point?
I think it's just got, as long as it doesn't influence the news making arm, that's always where it goes.
Right. And so like they have,
to me, because like if it's different if somebody reached out to me and said like, hey, I want to give you this, it's going to come out at 10, do you want the exclusive on it? And if it made sense to me and I said yes, then fine. But like at that point, you also don't then have the control over what I actually write. I'm not going to give you prior review, because that's not the way journalism works. And I can't let you know what I'm going to do ahead of time, but like, who I'm talking to, what I'm going to write basically, but you're not getting the editorial review of it. And I don't know where that begins and ends with some of these partners. I've literally no knowledge of some of these partnerships, so I don't know, but what you hope is that it does not basically impact the actual news gathering process. And there's also, I mean, heck, I believe the Ringer uses Rosenberg too, so he's somebody who actually gets paid for other things by WWE, the other roles that he performs, in hosting and things like
right,
that too.
and I don't know, I don't know the Ringer structure that well. My understanding is that David Shoemaker is kind of like the wrestling guy over there, and so he is in charge. He's an editor, I believe, at the website. So I would logically believe would be that he's in charge of kind of building the wrestling coverage to an extent.
If you're starting something that covers wrestling, it's probably not a bad thing to have at least a good working relationship with, the companies that you want to have access to the people of. So
I suppose,
and I think there's very easy ways that could go sideways if something huge and controversial happens that you then have to cover. And I think it would create some fun media ethics exercises.
Yes, I followed the Ringer's coverage of Vince McMahon's scandal.
I didn't. How was it?
Not very good. But
I have to check it out.
No, I mean, it is what it is. It's Peter Rosenberg on his show saying, I can't say anything about this. It's my boss. I can't say anything. And it's
he shouldn't be the one doing it anyway.
Right. Exactly. So, I mean, the Ringer is very interesting to me because I think they've done for two things. They've done a really good job, I think, taking certain segments of certain fan bases and catering towards them in a smart and intelligent way in what would previously be considered niche interests. They go very hard on, covering Marvel and covering those things. They have very intellectual discussions about, comic books and action movies and things like that maybe other news sources hadn't done. We talked about
some good people doing work over there too.
We talked about, I know they get some smart people in there. And like, we talked about, you mentioned like how enthusiastic are editors and media executives about pro wrestling. I have to imagine that Bill Simmons, who is a former Wrestling Observer newsletter subscriber and has affinity for pro wrestling, maybe not as hardcore of a fan. And he even admitted recently when he had Ariel Helwani on his show that he's a casual fan, but he probably is the biggest wrestling fan of anyone that's like a media figure at his level. So it's very interesting to see how their coverage has evolved over time. I've been a little disappointed by it, but
I enjoyed, and Cam Hawkins, who I do interact with a little bit, did a really nice piece on
he
Dax Harwood recently, and I think one on Ricky Starks recently too. But in Bill Simmons's case, it all comes down to whether or not he's watching every week, how engaged he is with it is one thing, but the fact that he understands why he has an audience that embraces it is important. Like that to me is the first step. Like you don't have to love it. I'm positive that Dave Meltzer doesn't enjoy thoroughly every single thing that he watches, but he covers it because he knows that he needs to, so it's not necessarily, you got to eat your oatmeal sometimes too. So
it's been interesting, I think, to see like how certain mainstream sports websites have dabbled in wrestling coverage. Some of them have committed to it more than others. I think Sports Illustrated has made a really big commitment to pro wrestling.
They have. It's strange though. Like I a lot of it I find an odd fit sometimes with some of the mainstream things.
Yeah, well,
as somebody who, when I started doing my blog, like I said, there were maybe like two others that were comparable to it that I even knew about. And it's always funny to me to see people getting involved because it's smart to do digitally. Once you look up, okay, well, what's doing well on SEO or this and that, you realize like, oh, well, there is an audience for this. So maybe we should put some resources into this. And everybody kind of did it. The last like 10 years or so have been very odd because I feel like everybody's sort of gotten the game at least a little bit.
Yeah. Like I see like, I've seen, CBS Sports, I think does a little bit of dedicated coverage to it. I think they at least cover like the pay-per-views and stuff. ESPN, you'll see a little bit here and there. I don't think they really dedicate a single person to kind of the wrestling beat. I followed The Athletic and Chris Fanini, who is I think their college football writer, and he does a little bit of wrestling too. I think in some of these instances, it's very interesting because you get people who are wrestling fans, but they don't always take covering wrestling as seriously as they might take as their regular beat.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Like, yeah, are the people that I've met through the industry that, the only reason I have contact with them is because I was covering it. Of course, there's people that are very nice to me that I talk to semi regularly. But it, like, you still need to give it the same respect, and that to me has always been what I've come back to, is that I think the reason I make any inroads with people is because I let them kind of understand pretty early on in the process that I understand what this is. And, for a while I could give it a little bit better of a spotlight than it might have otherwise. I remember having a conversation. I interviewed Matt Hardy. I have absolutely no idea what year this was. It was sometime in the late 2000s. It was in between when he had left WWE and maybe he was in TNA then. I don't even remember. But he was doing an appearance in Newburgh, New York. He was wrestling for Northeast. And I did a little write-up prior to it happening. And then I saw him at the show. I had actually never met him before. Now I've met him a bunch of times. But, he just said to me, it was nice doing that interview because it was nice talking to somebody that actually I didn't have to explain to them what wrestling was. Like sometimes the person gets assigned the story and it's like, they're giving you this awful characterization of like pro wrestling, which is a little bit of a soap opera and maybe a little bit of Broadway, but also kind of athletics at the same time. Like,
no,
you get
I
some
know
of these terrible stories that are written. And in Matt's case, I'm just letting them know, like, yeah, I know this thing you did. I know, asking specific questions about things that he did to lead him to other answers. So,
want to hear a funny story? We
absolutely.
I was covering when I was doing working for a weekly newspaper, and I got a call from someone who was promoting a wrestling show in the area. And so they called the local newspaper and said like, hey, we're running a wrestling show, this weekend or next week or next month or whatever it was. And he's like, we're going to have the NWO there. And I said like, the NWO.
Which members?
I said, right. So I said, the NWO. And he's like, yeah, NWO is like this big wrestling heel group. And they had Kevin Nash and Hulk Hogan and Randy Savage, and these people there. And I'm like, oh, okay. And I'm like, are those gentlemen going to be there? I mean, Savage was already dead at this time, so he wasn't.
Well, yeah,
but
clearly,
I was like, are those going to be the NWO members who's going to be there? And he's like, oh, well, those guys, I don't know if those guys are going to show up. And I think I can't remember. I think it was like it might have been Buff Bagwell actually. Might have been one of the guys. Like it was definitely the WCW B squad, the NWO B squad.
But you got to know what you're pitching,
right?
There was a great story when it's similar to that actually, which I found out after the fact, and it's funny because it's actually related to a show that I went to before I was working in media, but I was in college at the time. But so ECW used to run the Civic Center all the time, regularly, and I think their last TV taping before their last pay-per-view was at Middleton Civic Center.
This is ECW proper.
Yeah, this is 2000. So I think they called the Poughkeepsie Journal and they were like, because I know they called the college media too, and they didn't tell them what the heck was going on either. And they're like, there's going to be a big former WWF superstar, former WCW superstar that's going to appear on the ECW show in Poughkeepsie. And immediately they were asked, like, well, who? And they wouldn't say. So that's a problem. Like,
Yeah.
you at least need to let somebody know this is why this is important to go to. So that, of course, was the night that Scott Hall appeared at the Mid-Hudson Civic Center for ECW, came out to Ready or Not by the Fugees, but they did not give the media a heads up of Razor Ramon, Scott Hall, whatever is going to be there. It was an amazing moment live. It's still on YouTube if you ever catch it and watch it. I was there. I paid $9 for a ringside seat that day, if I remember the total correctly. But like, you need to know what's happening. You need to know what you're pitching. And a lot of times too, you get shortchanged. Like, people think that they can just, it's your privilege that you've received the interview with these people. Like, look, I can interview anybody, and I will give them the equal treatment no matter who I'm talking to. Like, I've interviewed 7th graders playing basketball. I've interviewed children who have won road races,
Yes.
and I've also interviewed Hulk Hogan. So like, I can give them the same interview. I can treat people equally. Hulk Hogan was a good one because that was he was appearing at Dutchess Stadium for the first Wrestling Under the Stars program that they did for Northeast Wrestling. It was him and Piper appearing in the ring, not wrestling, but in the segment for the first time. And God knows how long it was at that point. So I got Piper on the phone. I talked to Roddy Piper a few times before, and he's nice. And then I was like, what are the chances of me getting the Hulkster on the phone? And I was told, like, he's going to do it. He's going to do it. I'm like, all right, cool. He's got my phone number, and gave him a time frame of when he was going to call it. And then it's 7:00 in the morning on, like, I don't even know what day of the week it was, and my phone rings. And I was like, who in the world? I was working nights because I was a sports writer. I'm like, who in the world is calling me at 7 a.m. right now? And then I check my my voicemail. Hey, Phil, brother, this is Hulk Hogan. It's like, you gotta be kidding me. 7:00 in the morning, he calls and I accidentally deleted it because I was in such a state of shock. I was like, wait, wow, Hulk Hogan just left me a voicemail. So then I had to work it out with them when I was actually going to talk to him later on, because he got the wrong message and thought it was just like, oh yeah, just call when you have a chance. So he left me a voicemail at 7:00 in the morning, and then we ended up talking at like 1 or 2 in the afternoon or something that day anyway. But
until if you're interviewing a wrestler or a promoter or anyone that's in the wrestling industry, until you are actually talking to them, I never assumed that you were going to talk to them, I guess.
I have a pretty good, some people, again, I mentioned him a few times, but Michael Lombardi from Northeast Wrestling has been great at setting me up with various talents that he's got a direct contact to over the years. That's how I've talked to Hulk Hogan. That's how I talked to Ric Flair. That's how I talked to Bret Hart. That's how
they bring in
Michaels.
They're the kind of indie that brings in a lot of the older.
Bret Hart was a good one too, because they gave me a phone number. They said, call this number. And I said, well, whose number is this? And they said, it's the hotel where Bret Hart is staying. I was like, oh, interesting. So I call it. I asked for the room number or something. I don't remember how I did it.
Yeah, just connect me to the hitman. I think
I was like, I'm looking for Bret Hart's room. And then it was just, hello. And it was so obviously Bret Hart. I'm like, hi, is this Bret Hart?
That's funny.
It's surreal. It's surreal to have Bret Hart answering the phone, just hello.
All right, Phil. We're gonna wrap it up. Is there anything else you want to plug that we haven't discussed already?
No, just Under the Ring Pro Wrestling Conversations drops every Monday wherever you get your podcasts, Apple, Spotify, Google, Omni, wherever. And also we have a YouTube channel for it. And then the video of that drops every Wednesday of the week. I don't know when this is going to particularly publish, but my guest on the coming Monday, whenever this is Raquel Rodriguez from WWE. So that's coming out. I've got a lot of good ones too. I've interviewed a lot of your favorites. If you don't follow it, I've interviewed Rhea Ripley, Sonya Deville, Billy Corgan, Anthony Bowens, trying to think, Thunder Rosa, Serena Deeb, Brian Gewirtz was a really fun one. And I think he's going to be my first 2-time guest. So just a lot of Dave Meltzer, Brian Alvarez, very supportive too. I'm having a great time with it. It's the best part of my work week. whether you listen to it or not, I'm having a great time doing it. So enjoy it, and I'll keep doing it as long as I can.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, Phil. I appreciate you having you on the show. Everyone else who's
Thanks
been
for the
listening.
invite.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thanks everyone else who's been supporting the show. We'll be back at again in a few weeks. Not quite sure who our guest will be at that time, but I'm sure we'll figure something out. So thanks for listening, and we'll see you guys later.